Yeah, marketing should be fun.
Yeah.
We're the fun part of business. That's why my students major in marketing. They don't want to have to do the hard work that the finance people do.
Welcome to How I Made It in Marketing from Marketing Sherpa. We scour pitches from hundreds of creative leaders and uncover specific examples. Not just trending ideas or buzzword-laden schmaltz. Real-world examples to help you transform yourself as a marketer. Now, here's your host, the Senior Director of Content and Marketing at Marketing Sherpa, Daniel Burstein, to tell you about today's guest.
Here is the hardest thing for me in marketing and probably in life. It's truly understanding other people. I work to really understand the people closest to me, my wife, my kids, and it is so many levels harder to understand people who may be very different than me, like customers, if I'm engaged in copywriting, or even you, the listener of this podcast. How can I best serve you? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Anyway, if you face a similar challenge, lend us your ears for the next 30 minutes or so. We're going to discuss unconventional sources of customer data, interacting with real customers when you're developing a new product, getting frequent reality checks from your customers, plus keys to your marketing career like the strength of weak ties, finding collaborators with complementary skill sets, and always being vigilant about updating your assumptions. With our guest today, joining me is Dr. Michael Solomon, Professor of Marketing at St. Joseph's University. Thanks for joining us today, Michael.
Hey, Daniel, thanks so much for having me on.
So I'm just going to go through your LinkedIn real quick to give people a background of where you're from. You started undergrad at Brandeis with a BA in psychology. You went on to get your PhD in social psychology from UNC Chapel Hill. You're author of textbooks on principle of marketing, consumer behavior, introduction to business and social media marketing. You're a contributor to Forbes, a lot here. And your new book is called The New Chameleons, How to Connect with Consumers Who Defy Categorization. As I mentioned, you are the professor of marketing at St. Joseph's University. So we're going to get into a lot of interesting stories from your career. First, just kind of give us a brief understanding of what you're doing right now.
Well, right now I'm really focused on customer engagement and the big problems that poses. The pandemic, of course, hasn't helped with that, but that's probably the biggest challenge many of us face today is just getting our customers' attention, because as you observed, there's so many different people and companies out there that are jockeying for our attention. It really is a challenge for a marketer just to get heard. So I'm focusing on actually recently developed an online course using psychological principles to help your customers to stay engaged and focus on what you're doing. And once you have that focus, there's no guarantee you'll make a sale. But if you don't have it, you're certainly not going to go anywhere. So it's a big problem, and it's very interesting, of course, with the pandemic. That's thrown another wrinkle into things and made it even more challenging for everyone.
Yeah, it made it harder to learn about customers because we're not maybe seeing them as much. We're not, if we're in B2B, we're not going to events and seeing them. If we're B2C, not being able to go into a store and listen to your customers. But here's a really interesting story you shared with me kind of in the pre-interview, where you're working with Levi Strauss and you're trying to understand the psychology of blue jeans, which, I guess has a psychology. I hadn't really thought of that. So how did you do that? How did you try to better understand customers of Levi Strauss?
Well, I was working with the 501s brand, which is the original Levi's brand, and it has an amazing amount of heritage to it, and that's what we want today. We want brands that have a story to tell, and a company like Levi Strauss, of course, doesn't have to worry about that because they're sitting on hundreds or even thousands of these stories. And so what I did was one of the things I did as part of my engagement with them was they were kind enough to give me access to letters and packages that people had sent to the company, to headquarters in San Francisco over the past 150 years. And it was really fascinating to go through some of these letters that people had written talking about how this humble pair of blue jeans, this relatively inexpensive product, had made such a huge impact in their lives, whether it had saved them from injury. They were working somewhere and some scalding water went on them, but the pants protected them. But there were also very sentimental stories. I met my wife when I was wearing these jeans, or I got engaged when I was wearing these jeans. And so there was a tremendous amount of really original material there, straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And, when it comes to consumer data, that's what you want. You want the unfiltered stuff if you can get it. You can summarize it later, but it sure is helpful to look at what people are actually saying, not just reading a summary in a marketing research report.
Yeah. How did you use that information? How did Levi's use that information once you learned it?
Well, part of it was for PR purposes to publicize. We were doing some surveys about blue jeans and how people felt about blue jeans. So it was kind of like color, if you will, that we could insert into these reports. But I think it also gave us some insights, and especially reminded the company that people aren't buying a piece of fabric; they're buying a story, they're buying heritage. They're buying that brand, and that brand is really playing an important role in their lives. And that's something that even a company like Levi's that knows pretty well how to do this, it's good for them to be reminded, and for all of us to be reminded that really our customers are, they're all flesh and blood people, and every one of them has a story to tell, and your brand should be a part of that story.
Yeah, that's great. I like to call that customer intimacy, because as a writer, it can be so difficult to just write generally. Like, the more I can understand the customer and try to write directly to that person. So I agree with you. Even sometimes when maybe we read through all those letters, we don't use something specific from those letters, it does something in our minds, and we get to understand that customer a little better in their own language and speak to them better. So for me, I know you say here, don't overlook unconventional sources of data. And I love that. 150-year-old letters and packages are certainly unconventional. But, today is even if you're in the pandemic and you're stuck working from home, I know something that's helped me a lot is reading customer review sites. Like, if that's B2C, it might be Yelp or Google reviews, or B2B, it might be, G2 or Trustpilot or forums or LinkedIn, because hearing customers speak in their own words is so powerful. It's so powerful. Do you have any other good unconventional sources of data? Or?
Well, look, there's a lot of value in sending out surveys and questionnaires and so on, if you can get people to answer them these days. But as you point out, you're not getting it from the original source there. You're getting some analyst's version or summary of that. And so whenever you can get out and see the real thing happening, and when you talk about unconventional, I have not personally done this, but there are even people called garbologists, who go through consumers' garbage and look to see what they're really throwing out, as opposed to what they're telling surveyors that they're buying. And it doesn't get any more real than that. But I'm not saying go out and look through your neighbor's garbage by any means. But as you say, combing through reviews, because when consumers are posting this stuff, they're not participating in a study, so they're not trying to be polite and please the interviewer and all that. You're getting the real thing here.
Yeah, I agree. And I think also when they fill out a survey, I don't know what you think about this, but we're in a different frame of mind because we're being asked and kind of forced to reflect on a product. And so sometimes it's just kind of this unnatural feeling. I know even when I filled out a survey, versus if you were driven or motivated to write that letter or to post something on social media, that was just that human being's natural reaction to that product or that experience.
Right. Yeah.
All right, go on.
No, I was just going to say, the closer you get to the original source and not rely on that to be watered down or overanalyzed, the better you are, but again, you can't just absorb one or two of those, because then you have the representativeness problem, of course. And we've all been in situations, say in a focus group, where one really loud, domineering person has totally skewed the results. So we don't want to just base our findings, on one or two people. But to the extent that we can get in there and really, as you say, have some actual people in mind when we're developing our strategies and so on, that's very helpful. I think that's what's driving, the big push today toward customer personas and, creating this avatar or this ideal customer. And I think that can be very useful, as long as we keep in mind that there's no such thing as one ideal customer, because even your ideal customer is actually several people. He or she is going throughout the day, actually changing their identities. That's what I wrote my book about, the new chameleons. We're all changing our identities all the time. And so even just having that one, quote, ideal customer in mind is probably not quite good enough these days.
That's a good point, too. We're probably a different person at work than we are at home, in the morning than we are at night, on the weekend than we are on vacation. I mean, that's a very good point, yeah.
Yeah, and that's why you're starting to see some companies shifting toward when they organize their brand management, internally. Some of them are reorganizing around, say, occasions. Like if you're a snack food company, some of the big snack food companies have done this. So they no longer have a brand that they're organized around, like Fritos. They're organized around an event like, say, tailgating. And that allows you to think about all the different products that play together in a tailgate or some other situation.
That's great. That's what we would call also moving from company centricity. Like we've got these divisions and these brands to customer centricity, right? To having that customer idea. So one last thing I want to mention, because you brought up a really good point of the loudest voice. In a letter, in a review, in anything, is another thing you can do is pair this with quantitative data. So a big challenge with quantitative data sometimes, either if we're looking at analytics or running an A/B test or sales figures. So you see this thing happen, but the biggest challenge is, well, why the heck did it happen? You know what I mean? And then you're trying to form a hypothesis of it, and actually seeing how people are talking can help you, like, okay, backfill, like maybe this makes sense here, as opposed to relying on an outlier or two.
Yeah, I like to tell my students that a survey like that is very valuable because it tells us what we're looking at, but it doesn't tell us why we're looking at it. So you need both. It's not a question. A lot of people say, well, I'm a qualitative guy or I'm a quantitative guy. Well, that's ridiculous. Then you're a hammer in search of a nail. Yeah, and that happens a lot. People get trained in some technique and they want to use it for everything, and that's not a good idea. It's a better idea, if possible, to triangulate by using multiple techniques, and then you can start to see whether there's some consistency falling out there.
Exactly. All right, let's take a look at your next story. You say, interact as much as possible with real consumers when you're developing a new product, which we kind of touched on. But tell me, how did you do that with Black & Decker, where you were able to discover something the engineers didn't realize?
Yeah, and it was interesting. We followed some housewives around as they were using a particular product that the company made. It was moderately successful, but not really doing great. And what we realized is that when we followed these housewives around, and it's a product that cleans showers and things like that. Not too sexy, I would say, but effective. We realized that they were having essentially to carry the product in two hands, one hand for the actual cleaner and one for a reservoir that held the cleaning fluid. And what we realized is that if we integrated the cleaning fluid into the main device, then that would free up a hand. This is not exactly a cure for cancer, but the engineers hadn't occurred to them because they were more focused on, how do we deliver this liquid most efficiently into the cleaning surface. And so by taking the customer's perspective and by actually listening to them talk out loud, if you will, as they're doing this task, we were able to come up with a small insight. They made that design change, and the product wound up doing very, very well as a result.
That's awesome. I mean, I've heard that called customer anthropology, but if you're listening and you've got a digital product, let's say you don't have a physical product and you're saying like, well, this wouldn't apply to me. Here's a great case study we did before with eBags that was somewhat similar. eBags, they sell luggage, they were selling purses with this, and they were trying to understand how people were using, well, women really were using the app to buy purses. And so they actually went in these women's homes when they were looking for purses, and they found that, kind of the engineering mindset was, okay, how do we get people as quickly as possible to these purses? How do we make the search as efficient as possible to get them to the right purses? But that's not how women were shopping. It was like, after a long day, they put their kids to bed, they whip out their phone, they whip out the app, and they get a glass of wine maybe, and they're just kind of liking to browse and they're liking to look around. And so this insight, which would be really hard to get digitally, like you mentioned, actually going and following people around in their homes, be really hard to get digitally. By going in people's homes and seeing how they interacted, they were able to actually see this, insight of maybe the most efficient way to design this user experience isn't the best way. So,
yeah, I guess, I don't know if market researchers are having to wear masks when they go in people's homes these days, but I doubt that's a very popular research technique right about now. But you're right. I mean, even if you're in e-commerce, you're selling, your process is totally online. You can still follow people and see what they're doing and how they want to use your product. And your basic insight is, look, there's a lot more to shopping than buying.
Exactly, yeah. And there's probably a lot more going on in their day than using your product, too. So you're seeing in that small moment, how do they use it and what else is going on and how do they get distracted?
Yeah,
So.
and that what else is very, very important. That's been very important for me throughout my career is looking at adjacencies and looking at how people are incorporating these brands into a lifestyle that also involves the simultaneous use of other brands. And so by looking at what people are expecting to see in one category, given that they have something in another, that kind of horizontal perspective is actually lacking, I think, in a lot of marketing strategies. But people don't buy a brand. You're selling them a brand, but they're buying something that fits into everything else they're doing all day.
Right. And we're in our four walls or at home in our virtual four walls, and we're only thinking about our products. And, something I've noticed too in my career is it's the same for our marketing messages and our advertising messages. And so we created this like customer theory tool because when I would, for example, if I was working on a video or, an ad or something like that, I would experience it, with like studio headphones, with like studio, speakers with this, massive, you're in the editor's suite where you have this nice catered lunch. And then you have this like massive screen where you see every detail and you've seen it 32 times when they edit it and you know every detail. And then you actually go out in the world and it's very disappointing where they're looking at on their phone on a subway with crummy headphones where they're distracted or they're, like their kid just stubbed their toe and is crying and this other thing is going on. And you don't realize how the thing that you're spending so much time on is such a sliver of their attention and their time.
That's right. And we all have egos and we all believe that if it's important to us, it must be important to everybody else. So, if you're selling kitty litter, you're up all night wondering about the best brand of kitty litter and you figure, well, everybody else must be worrying about it too,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, this is a great one. I've experienced this in my career. Often as marketers, we're in a different demographic, persona, whatever you want to call it, than our customer, and how do you better understand them? And so you talk about getting frequent reality checks from your customers. So as an author of several textbooks, what have you learned in writing those textbooks? Because you get farther and farther away from that demographic, right? As you go on in your career.
Yeah, exactly. You got it. I mean, I love to say every fall when I walk into my classroom, I've gotten 1 year older, but they haven't. They're still 20 and I'm not, So yeah, it does get very difficult to keep that perspective. And so, in many cases, our customers are dissimilar to ourselves, and yet we have trouble believing that. And there's even been research that's been done on brand managers that shows that, as they're thinking about this persona or whatever, they're actually thinking about an ideal version of themselves. They assume their customer is just a slightly better version of themselves, and that is often not the case. And I certainly find that with writing textbooks. Especially in a field like marketing. If I was writing a book on algebra, I probably wouldn't worry about it too much. But in marketing, obviously, things change very, very, very quickly, way too quickly for most of us. And of course, for these young students, if something happened in 2019, that's ancient history. So there's this constant struggle to stay, really current. And so sometimes what I find is when I'll say to a student, did this example that I used make any sense to you? And they'll say, well, frankly, I didn't know what you were talking about, but I figured you must have meant well, so I went along with it. Memories are short, and it's just so important to try to take your buyer's perspective, even if you're, say, 50 years older than they are. The further away you are, the more important it is to check in with them frequently and say, have I got this right? Am I at least close? And on the other hand, making sure that you don't try to sound too much like somebody who you're not, being a 60-year-old copywriter, writing an ad for 20-somethings and trying to sound like a 20-something is probably not a great idea.
Yeah, the examples you used kind of blew my mind because you said the killing of bin Laden and 9/11. And, I hadn't thought of it because 9/11 was such a big, I still remember exactly where I was on 9/11. My daughter is a college freshman now, and I hadn't really thought about it, but she was born after 9/11. So she, that's such a different experience than what I had with it.
Yeah. Some of the bedrock memories that we take for granted, young people have, well, I won't say they've never heard of 9/11, but they just know it was a really bad thing that they didn't have to deal with, Yeah,
they didn't experience it vividly like we did. We're remembering, that was my generation's probably Kennedy moment where, it's like you knew where you were when nothing happened. So when I read this example from you, it got me thinking also of internal communications within a company, because here's an experience I faced. So with Marketing Sherpa, the great thing is we're pretty influential in the marketing space. And so, but when you're in the actual building with these other people, you don't realize that other person sitting next to you, thousands of people are reading his articles. And so I used in a company meeting, I thought this was just a brilliant analogy. Everyone's going to love this. I used the Jackson 5. And I talked about, hey, to the rest of the world, Michael Jackson was this amazing talent. And he was, but to like Randy or his brother, he was just the annoying little brother. And so when we're in this building together, you're like, that's whoever is annoying, whatever. But out in the world, they're actually someone. And I look and I'm like, this is going to be huge. And I get a lot of blank stares because I realized a lot of the people in the company were younger than me and had no idea what I was talking about with the Jackson 5. Michael Jackson was even ancient to them. They didn't understand that. So I love your example.
I knew, Daniel, I knew it was over for me when I was teaching an undergrad class, and this was many, many years ago, actually. I mentioned the Beatles. And this girl in the front row had this puzzled look on her face. And I said, the Beatles, the Beatles. And she thought about it. And she said, oh, wait, wasn't that Paul McCartney's old band?
That's great.
I said, oh, I'm done here.
Oh, man. All right. Well, we talked about some of the things you made in your career in marketing, but the other key thing we do as marketers is we collaborate with people, right? No real marketer works in a silo. So the first person you mentioned that you really collaborated with and learned from was John Greco, the chair and CEO of Marketing Impact Council currently, and I think he used to lead the DMA. So you learned from him the strength of weak ties. So tell us that story. What is the strength of weak ties?
Yeah, well, that means, that's an expression that means that that really we tend to focus on our strongest ties within a network, the people we know, the people we work with, our clients, et cetera. Those are our strong ties. But social scientists like to talk about the strength of weak ties as well, and these are the connections that you have to other people's networks. And so you can kind of, if you're collaborating with someone who has their own, like you were saying with other writers at Marketing Sherpa, everybody's got their own kind of constellation of networks and so on, and there may be relatively little overlap between your network, which could be a very rich network, and somebody else's network. So by making that jump, essentially gaining permission to get access to their network as well, you're suddenly catapulting yourself into an entirely new, I was going to say minefield. I don't think it's a minefield, but an entirely new set of possibilities that you wouldn't have if you stuck with your own network, even though that network is quite strong. So it's always good to connect with somebody who is very, very active, but is not necessarily running in your circles.
So these are, I forgot what book it was, but they call them the super influencers and the kind of super connector type of folks. And how did John Greco's network help you out in your career?
Yeah, well, in this case, as I mentioned, I'm developing this online course on customer engagement, and John has an amazing network. He's had a long career leading the Direct Marketing Association and some other big organizations, and so obviously. Many of the people that he's had the opportunity to interact with are not people that I, as a college professor, would have encountered. So it's tremendously valuable for me to be able to go up to one of John's contacts and say, this is something you might be interested in. You normally wouldn't have heard about it, but because I know him, now I know you.
That's great. Yeah. I hesitate to say this because I get so many sales messages, but when I started on LinkedIn, I used to be very, very rigid about only accepting people that I really had worked with and knew very well. And I read this article by Chris Brogan who was just explaining, hey, look, LinkedIn works better if you just accept all connections. That's just how the platform works. And so a few weeks ago, I'd written a case study about hiring practices and employee retention practices of companies. And one of the sources was I'm in Jacksonville, Florida. One of the sources was in Minnesota. And after, we wrote the article, he connected with me. And it's funny, he reached out and he said, hey, I see you're in Jacksonville and you're connected with so-and-so. Do you know them? And that's someone I happen to know socially. It's not even, through marketing. I just happen to, our kids, we go to the same synagogue. And so I just thought it was like, it just kind of, not that I used it in any business way, but it blew my mind that this guy had written this article way out in Minnesota, also had a connection that I knew very well here in Jacksonville that I knew socially. So if you are in business development or sales and not sending out the spammy LinkedIn messages I get 20 times a day, maybe there's a constructive way to use that in your career.
Yeah. I'm no LinkedIn expert, that's for sure, but I've never quite understood this thing of when people block, access. And I'm thinking, what do you think you're giving away? I mean, this is not an invitation to your daughter's wedding. I mean, this is just, it's just a click. So what is so important about you that you can't share your connections? But I'm sure people have legitimate reasons. Like you say, I don't receive, 10,000 sales pitches a day, only maybe 1,000. So I'm not in that category.
Yeah. So here's your next example, Dr. Maleka Bregman, and feel free to correct me because I probably got that wrong. And I looked her, I think she's the associate professor of marketing right now at Vrije Universiteit Brussels.
Yes.
And so you talk about finding collaborators with complementary skill sets, and this has helped me in my career. So how are you collaborating with Dr. Bregman?
We're in the early stages of a study looking at robots and how they might be used in service settings. And she has a lot of background with that, and at her university in Brussels, there's a big robotics institute there. And so this is a great example where, many of us might have, 70 or 80% of the assets we need to do a project, but we're missing a few key pieces. And, it's just like a company that acquires another company to get technology that they needed. Think about acquiring Collaborators, and hopefully not a hostile takeover, but, think about acquiring Collaborators strategically to plug the holes, in, because none of us has 100% of the skills we need to do anything. I certainly don't. And so by looking for someone who has, let's say, statistical expertise or experience in a certain industry, they're usually going to benefit from you as well. So it's there's that expression, no man is an island. And that's really true. We can try to do everything ourselves. And at some level, we don't want to delegate. There's a happy medium. We don't want to delegate everything. But I really have found that 9 times out of 10, you're better off admitting that you need some help and being proud of it, really. Being proud that you had the foresight and the ability to see that you had to plug some gaps. There's nothing wrong with being strategic.
Yeah, it's funny you talk about it in a corporate way, how corporations talk about their core competency and what they're going to outsource. But,
right.
What I've learned in my career, 21 Laws of Leadership was a great course I took. I forgot the guy's name, but one thing he talks about is people don't pay for average. And this idea that like you really need to, there's some ideas of like you need to be well-rounded, you need to be a Renaissance marketer, a Renaissance man or woman, and do everything. And he's like, no, you need to find out what is your special skill and just go all in on that. And the other things, work with other people on it. Because if you're going to be average at it, it's not going to help you. And so I know in my career, like I know my skill, it's writing, storytelling, content creation. And when it's come to things like design, to technology, to all these other things, like to your point, it's like find someone who you can collaborate with, who you can, really rely on for that. Because I'm never going to be that good of a tech guy. It's just not going to happen. So I got the computer on, I got this recording set up. That's enough.
Yeah, and it's it's quite possible that tech guy can't write his way out of a paper bag, and he needs you. So
right, and that's that great teamwork. That's that great collaboration, which we're talking about. So the last person we want to mention you collaborated with, Jacqueline Liu. She's the Executive Director and Global Head of Consumer and Brand Health Practice, CI Product Leadership at Nielsen IQ. And you mentioned always be vigilant about updating assumptions. So how did Jacqueline help you update your own assumptions?
Well, I recently worked with Nielsen I directed a project to update their brand health model that they use for clients around the world. To help them understand what their brand is, the impact it's making on consumers, how consumers think about it, and working on this with a huge company like Nielsen was really great because obviously they're dealing with clients in just about every country in the world and dealing with data from every country in the world. So as we look at something like brand health, we have to recognize that, of course, the same brand can have very different meanings and different profiles as we move around from market to market. And it's just so important to remember that. And when you're working with people, in a global company like Nielsen, and you realize, they've been doing this working from home stuff for a long time because their teams are made up of people that are, taken from offices around the world. So in this case, she's based in Malaysia. Some of her team members were in Vietnam, in Austria. It was just fascinating. But there really is some danger there of, having this mindset that, well, I know the way it works in my country. How different could it be anywhere else? And, most of us have had that eye-opening moment where we realize that a brand that we've been involved with has a totally different profile in another country. And to assume that you can just move from place to place with your, let's say, American-centric attitude is really, really a mistake.
Yeah, I'll tell you one thing I learned too, internally working with others, because so I'm based here on the East Coast and I'm originally from New York. And so, the stereotype of people from that area are not, I don't know what the word is, shy. So when we're, working on a project together, I have no problem sharing my thoughts and opinions and how we can improve it in these things. And kind of I've learned over time, not only people from other countries, certainly when we've worked with people from Europe and Asia, they definitely don't have that same kind of brashness to interacting. But even the Midwest, when we've worked with, some folks from the Midwest, I've had to learn to kind of like, okay, kind of dial it back a bit and really pull it out of them, because they're not going to want to say anything negative about the project. They're not going to want to raise any red flags. They'll just kind of go along with the strongest voice in that meeting. And so really kind of being aware of those different cultural differences and letting them know it's okay if you see any flaws in the project. Let's know it now before it, fails on the back end, and just nod and like, yeah, that's kind of what I thought, but didn't say anything.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great rule. Always have at least one New Yorker on your research team, and so you can get to the facts quickly.
Yeah, let's go here. So, all right. Well, this has been great, but your stories have been great. But before we go, what can you tell the audience? What is your advice to them about the key qualities of an effective marketer?
Yeah, well, sell lots of stuff. But other than that, I'd say, I guess the key, and this won't surprise you based on our conversation, it is empathy. The key is being able to, take yourself out of your analyst or your brand manager persona, and to the extent that you can, try to understand what you're selling from the point of view of the customer. And that can be a tall order, of course, depending on what the product is. But, always start with, at least with the assumption that your frame of reference is not the same as your customers. If it turns out to be, then no harm done, but it's likely that there's going to be some differences. So don't just sit in your office and assume that you know how people will react to this latest promotion or whatever without testing it first. That doesn't necessarily mean doing a representative survey with 2,000 respondents or something, but try to get some reality checks as you're going, and don't wait until the end. Bring your customers into the process. I've written a lot about co-creation and the importance of collaborating with your customers, because they often are your best salespeople and they often are your best product designers.
Yeah, that's great. And one thing I would add too, it can be fun. It is, while it's really hard to try to understand other people, it's really fun to me to learn other things about them, to be curious about them, and to work with them when they're really, passionate and helping you create something. So
yeah, marketing should be fun. Yeah. We're the fun part of business. That's why my students major in marketing. They don't want to have to do the hard work that the finance people do.
I like that. That's why I majored in marketing. So, all right. Thanks so much for your time, Michael.
Thank you. It's been great.
Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Thank you for joining us for How I Made It in Marketing with Daniel Burstein. Now that you've gotten inspiration for transforming yourself as a marketer, get some ideas for your next marketing campaign from Marketing Sherpa's extensive library of free case studies at marketingsherpa.com. That's marketing, SHERPA.com.